That's a fantastic setup for a deeply engaging voiceover. I will now integrate the image prompts into the narration script exactly as instructed, ensuring the storytelling flow remains perfect. Image 1, official white envelope on hand. This story was supposed to be about peace, about the smell of earth and the quiet hum of an honest living. It was about a patch of land that had been farmed for generations. Then came the letter, a thin, official white envelope that shattered everything. The paper didn't mention fines or petty rules. It stated a new plan. My acreage, my livelihood, was slated to become a dog park. A fenced-in, barking, manicured amenity for a community that had just moved in. They thought the battle was over when the HOA board voted unanimously. They were wrong. What they failed to see was the decades-old deed that revealed the single brutal truth about my property line. A line I used to build a wall of silent, absolute revenge. You won't believe what happened when they tried to open the gates and realized every road in was gone. That's a fantastic setup for a deeply engaging voiceover. I will now integrate the image prompts into the narration script exactly as instructed, ensuring the storytelling flow remains perfect. Image 1, official white envelope on hand. This story was supposed to be about peace, about the smell of earth and the quiet hum of an honest living. It was about a patch of land that had been farmed for generations. Then came the letter, a thin, official white envelope that shattered everything. The paper didn't mention fines or petty rules. It stated a new plan. My acreage, my livelihood, was slated to become a dog park. A fenced-in, barking, manicured amenity for a community that had just moved in. They thought the battle was over when the HOA board voted unanimously. They were wrong. What they failed to see was the decades-old deed that revealed the single brutal truth about my property line. A line I used to build a wall of silent, absolute revenge. You won't believe what happened when they tried to open the gates and realized every road in was gone. Image 2, Elias on farm with barn and distant suburb. The story's true beginning was not with the letter, but with the land itself. Our main character, a man known simply as Elias in the quiet corner of the county, was the steward of the last true farm. It wasn't a commercial operation. It was a sanctuary, a 20-acre sprawl of heirloom apple trees, sun-baked soil, and a barn that leaned into the wind like an old friend. He was a creature of routine. The pre-dawn coffee on the porch, the rhythmic clanging of the well pump, the comforting solitude. This farm, passed down through generations, was his identity, his quiet rebellion against the rush of the modern world. The problem arrived not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow, creeping encroachment. A development called Stonehaven Vista had sprouted up on the far side of Elias's west boundary. It was all manicured lawns, identical vinyl siding, and a rigid covenant. The kind of place where every shrub was accounted for and freedom was measured in permissible paint colors. At first, the development was just a distant hum, a faint annoyance. Elias and his farm, situated in an unincorporated pocket, remained untouched. But as Stonehaven Vista filled up, its residents, led by a newly elected, fiercely ambitious HOA president, began to look beyond their perfect little grid. They looked at Elias's farm, the unmanicured edges, the dirt roads that serviced his property, the very authenticity that defied their aesthetic rules, and they saw not a livelihood, but an eyesore. The initial skirmishes were small, misplaced complaints about the smell of manure or the sight of his vintage tractor. Elias dismissed them as the inevitable grumblings of people too insulated from reality. But the Stonehaven HOA possessed a relentless, almost corporate zeal. They were a collective with rules, lawyers, and a shared vision of perfect uniformity. And for them, Elias's 20 acres represented an irresistible opportunity to expand their pristine boundaries. They saw his empty dirt road entrance, a simple gravel drive used only by his trucks and family, as a weak point. The tension wasn't about a dog park yet. It was about control. It was about a collective of newcomers who believed that their shared aesthetic preference should trump a lifetime of independent existence. Elias had his roots deep in the earth. The HOA had its roots deep in bureaucracy. And when the two forces finally met, only one could stand. The stage was set, not for a simple argument but for a war over land, legacy, and the definition of a neighborhood. The slow burn quickly ignited into a blaze. The initial complaints about the smell of soil and the old tractor were merely the opening volleys. Once the HOA, fueled by the relentless energy of their president, realized Elias wouldn't simply surrender his way of life, they shifted their tactics from passive-aggressive commentary to systematic legal and bureaucratic assault. The first truly sinister move wasn't about the farm itself, but about its accessibility. Elias had always relied on two simple, unpaved lanes for access: a main gravel drive off a county road and a seldom-used secondary track that ran along the property's far boundary, a track he used to move equipment and bring in feed. The HOA focused on the secondary track. They argued, citing an ambiguous clause in their Stonehaven Vista covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, that the road, being adjacent to their newly paved common area, was technically an unkept easement that lowered property values. A thick, official letter arrived, stating that if Elias did not pave, landscape, and install colonial-style street lamps along the secondary track within 60 days, at his expense, the HOA would petition the county to decommission it, effectively removing a crucial lifeline to his acreage. The cost of their demanded renovations was astronomical, clearly designed not as a request, but as a financial sledgehammer. Elias pushed back, of course, filing his own legal challenge, arguing that the easement predated their entire development and was essential for his agricultural work. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and the HOA had deep pockets and a team of focused attorneys. The conflict then moved to the core of his livelihood, the farm itself. The official announcement arrived in the form of a town hall meeting invitation, but the real intent was tucked into an innocuous-sounding agenda item: recreational amenity development. The plan, presented with glossy, full-color renderings, showed his 20 acres transformed into the Stonehaven Vista Dog Park and Community Green. The audacity was breathtaking. Their legal justification was a shocking twist of historical ambiguity. They claimed that decades ago, before his grandfather legally solidified the independent deed, the land had been intended for community use by a long-defunct regional planning commission, a claim that was tenuous at best, but powerful enough to introduce chaos and uncertainty. The narrative they spun to the wider community was brilliant and manipulative. They painted Elias not as a farmer, but as an obstructionist hoarding prime recreational space that the children and pets deserved. The emotional leverage was devastating. Elias found himself suddenly shunned. Residents he'd waved to for years now crossed the street. He found trash dumped along his fence line. One morning, his ancient, beautifully weathered mailbox was found flattened. The escalating fines began to feel like clockwork. They were levied for violations that defied reason. A fine for aesthetic nonconformity, because his barn was painted red and not one of the approved three-tone earth palettes. A fine for noise pollution, because his rooster crowed before 7 a.m. The most absurd, a weekly fine for improper waste management, because his compost pile, essential to his soil, was deemed a nuisance odor. Each fine was small enough not to bankrupt him instantly, but large enough to bleed him dry over time, creating a crushing psychological weight. Elias paid the first few, fighting each one tooth and nail, but the fight was exhausting and the HOA appeals process was deliberately labyrinthine. He realized the goal wasn't the money. The goal was to break his spirit and force a quick, lowball sale of the land. This constant, nagging harassment finally led him to the moment of clarity, the moment he stopped reacting and started plotting. He was sitting on his porch one evening, watching the lights of Stonehaven Vista twinkle in the distance, a cold, calculated fury replacing his frustration. He was determined to not just survive, but to win in a way that was final, absolute, and legal. His focus shifted entirely from fighting their unjust fines and court claims to poring over the original land survey documents in the county archives. He wasn't looking for a loophole in their rules. He was looking for an unassailable truth in the history of the earth beneath his feet. He spent weeks submerged in dusty, brittle deeds and faded maps, tracing property lines that hadn't been walked in a century. And then he found it. It wasn't a flaw in his deed or the farm's acreage. It was a simple, overlooked fact concerning the surrounding undeveloped parcels. the very land the HOA had been using as leverage to pressure him. Elias discovered that the original developer of the area, years before Stonehaven Vista was even conceived, had neglected to legally connect 3 small, oddly shaped, adjoining plots to the new community grid, leaving them technically landlocked and unincorporated, save for one tiny, ancient public access easement that ran diagonally through one of them. The HOA assumed these plots were under their jurisdiction because they were surrounded by Stonehaven roads. They had been slowly buying them up, consolidating their power, but one crucial part of that puzzle remained unsolved, untouched, and utterly undefended. Elias saw the whole game board instantly. The HOA wanted his farm to build a dog park. They wanted his access. If he could control their access, the access to their own community, he would hold the ultimate paralyzing card. The tension was now unbearable. He had found the countermove, but it required an audacious risk and a race against time before the HOA finalized their purchase of the last remaining parcels. The next phase of his plan required money, silence, and the ruthless exploitation of a dead-end public access rule nobody in Stonehaven Vista even knew existed. Elias stood up from his porch, the old farmer's cap shading eyes that were now cold, analytical, and utterly determined. The legal war was over. The strategic war had just begun. The question was, could he complete his purchases and secure the land before the HOA finished their final legal maneuver to condemn his farm? The money was gone. Every last reserve, every penny saved for decades, had been poured into securing the 3 neglected, adjoining parcels of land. The purchases were executed in absolute secrecy, conducted through a shell company and a series of blind trusts, a maneuver designed to shield Elias from any premature counterattack by the HOA. This was not a fight over a dog park anymore. It was a siege, a relentless, perfectly legal campaign to control the very ground upon which Stonehaven Vista rested. The HOA, blinded by their impending victory over Elias's farm, never suspected a thing. Their focus remained laser-sharp on the final hearing for the eminent domain claim they were pursuing, the one that would legally condemn Elias's acreage and turn his apple orchard into their community green. They were so consumed with the image of their future dog park that they ignored the quiet shuffling of deeds happening right under their manicured noses. The day of the confrontation was not the court date, but the day they broke ground. The HOA president, a woman of ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency, had convinced the board to move ahead with the initial survey and fencing, confident the legal outcome was assured. They arrived at the edge of Elias's farm, not in a small group, but with a full construction crew, a fleet of yellow dozers, chain-link fencing, and a local news camera crew invited to capture the moment they reclaimed the land for the community. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate Elias, to show the absolute power of the collective over the individual. Elias was waiting. He stood at the old gravel access point, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn denim jacket, his posture radiating a stillness that was far more unnerving than anger. He didn't yell or protest. He didn't engage with the news crew or the smirking HOA president. He simply waited for the moment the first bulldozer blade touched his dirt. The president approached him, a confident, patronizing smile fixed on her face. She held aloft a laminated notice from the HOA attorney, a final piece of paper meant to finalize his defeat. "Elias," she announced, loud enough for the cameras. "The legal process is in motion. We have the mandate of the community. Today we begin." As she took one final, triumphant step toward the farm's boundary, Elias didn't move. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out not a weapon or a lawyer's brief, but a simple laminated plat map, a copy of the ancient county survey he had unearthed. He handed it to her silently. She glanced at it, dismissively, before her eyes snagged on a series of bold, red lines that had been recently drawn. These lines represented the 3 parcels he had secretly acquired, parcels that now completely surrounded the entirety of Stonehaven Vista on 3 of its 4 sides. But that wasn't the bombshell. The true, devastating legal twist was in the footnotes. Elias had not just bought the land. He had, in the process, legally established a private access easement that ran across all 3 newly acquired parcels. And then, he had invoked a centuries-old, obscure county land use law that allowed him, as the sole owner of the encircling private property, to legally petition the county to decommission and privatize every single road that connected Stonehaven Vista to the outside world, save for the single main arterial road that was technically an actual state highway. The president's dismissive smile evaporated. Her eyes darted from the map to the construction crew and back to Elias. Her composure finally cracked as she grasped the chilling reality. He had bought the surrounding perimeter of the neighborhood and had closed all but one of their exits. The true climax, however, was not the map. It was the moment the heavy machinery stopped. A different truck, a small, unassuming county maintenance vehicle, pulled up not to Elias's farm, but to the secondary Stonehaven entrance, the one the HOA had nearly decommissioned to spite him earlier. Two workers emerged, not in construction gear, but in official county safety vests, carrying massive, industrial-grade concrete barriers and a bucket of yellow paint. Elias then spoke, his voice low, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You claimed my farm for a dog park. You used every legal trick to choke my livelihood. You targeted my access." He gestured to the county crew, who were now methodically painting bold, yellow no trespassing lines across the road and positioning the barriers. "I didn't fight your access. I bought the land beneath it." He waited for the president to fully process the horror. By securing those 3 surrounding parcels and leveraging the historical easement, Elias had forced the county to recognize his rights as the new property owner, granting him the power to immediately terminate the HOA's perceived access points. He was merely enacting the exact kind of property line absolutism they had tried to use against him. The construction crew, seeing the county vehicle and the new barriers, lowered their equipment and began to pack up, instinctively recognizing the boundary dispute was now far above their pay grade. The president was left standing there, her perfect community vision collapsing in a cloud of legal dust and bureaucratic failure. The news camera crew, initially focused on the benevolent HOA, now pivoted their lenses to the concrete barriers and the look of sheer, unadulterated shock on the president's face. The humiliation was total. She hadn't just lost the fight for the dog park. She had been outmaneuvered, outspent, and politically neutralized on her own turf. Elias turned and walked back toward his farmhouse, leaving the HOA president to stare at the newly privatized road she thought was theirs, the road that now stood as a silent, physical monument to her stunning defeat. The farmer hadn't just saved his land. He had built a cage around the very people who sought to destroy him. The siege was complete, but the long-term impact on Stonehaven Vista was only just beginning. The spectacle of the concrete barriers being rolled into place was the end of one war and the violent, shocking start of another. The silence that followed Elias's simple exit was the sound of the entire Stonehaven Vista community realizing they had been utterly and perfectly checkmated. The HOA president, standing among the defeated construction equipment, was no longer a figure of power, but an architect of disaster. Her face, moments ago radiating supreme confidence, was now a portrait of absolute, unadulterated humiliation. The immediate fallout was chaos. Residents, returning home from work or errands, found the familiar shortcuts and side roads they had used for years suddenly blocked by heavy, uncompromising concrete. The single remaining access point, the main arterial that had been merely one of several exits, instantly became a choke point. What was once a graceful, 5-minute drive into the subdivision turned into a 45-minute wait just to navigate the bottleneck. The pristine community, built on the promise of effortless living, became a self-imposed prison of asphalt and frustration. The emotional backlash was swift and visceral. The arrogance that had fueled the HOA's campaign against Elias immediately turned inward. The board members, who had unanimously supported the dog park condemnation, found themselves facing a community that no longer saw them as visionary leaders, but as the architects of this logistical nightmare. The complaints about the rooster's crow or the aesthetic of the barn vanished, replaced by furious demands about access, traffic, and plummeting property values. The war over petty aesthetics had been replaced by a crisis over basic function. The legal unraveling. The HOA, desperate and hemorrhaging community trust, launched a frenzied legal counterattack. They argued public necessity, historical use, and malicious intent, pouring thousands more dollars into a legal fight that Elias had already won months ago in the solitude of the county archives. Elias's quiet precision proved unassailable. He had meticulously targeted the 3 surrounding parcels not for their size, but for their specific, complex, and unmerged legal history. His legal team presented the court with a clean, devastatingly simple case. Elias was the rightful, lawful owner of the land, and under the specific centuries-old county codes he had invoked, he possessed the absolute right to control access across his private property lines, especially since Stonehaven Vista had adequate, albeit inconvenient, public access remaining via the state highway. The court ruling was the final, crushing blow. It confirmed the legality of Elias's move, not only vindicating his land purchases but also implicitly chastising the HOA's prior behavior. The ruling noted the HOA's own recent, aggressive attempts to decommission Elias's original access points as evidence of their intent to isolate him. The irony was palpable. The same power they sought to wield had been turned against them with surgical precision. The legal fees bankrupted the HOA's reserves, forcing a massive, emergency assessment on every homeowner, an extra layer of financial insult added to their ongoing logistical injury. The permanent scars of defeat. The long-term impact on Stonehaven Vista was profound and irreversible. The initial vision of a perfect, uniform paradise evaporated. Property value collapse. Real estate listings for Stonehaven Vista plummeted. Buyers were immediately deterred by the access problem, which quickly became a notorious local issue. Houses remained on the market for months, forcing prices down. The neighborhood that had prided itself on exclusivity and value was now seen as a cautionary tale of bureaucratic overreach. The fall of the president. The aggressive, power-hungry HOA president was publicly and privately destroyed. Facing recall, lawsuits, and the intense, persistent animosity of her neighbors, she resigned in disgrace. Her short tenure remembered only as the era when she sold the neighborhood's future for a dog park that was never built. The subsequent boards were ineffective, focused entirely on the impossible task of negotiating with Elias, the new silent gatekeeper. The new reality, the massive concrete barriers, initially placed temporarily, became permanent fixtures. They were painted with warnings and illuminated by solar lamps, a constant, physical monument to the HOA's defeat. Stonehaven Vista was forced to adapt to being a community with only one working door, a daily reminder of the farmer they had tried to crush. The children and dogs were left without their park, and the adults were left with crippling traffic and financial loss. Elias, the farmer who had simply wanted to be left alone, finally found his peace. The constant stream of intimidating letters stopped. The fines ceased. The noise of the dozers was replaced by the comforting, rhythmic sound of his well pump once more. His farm, the apple trees, the leaning barn. They stood untouched, now surrounded by a silent, defeated suburb. He never removed the concrete barriers from the surrounding parcels. He simply maintained his new property lines and his newly established private easements. On quiet evenings, he would stand on his porch, sipping coffee, watching the distant headlights of the single line of cars waiting to get into Stonehaven Vista. They had demanded a dog park on his land. He had delivered a siege on theirs. The story of Elias is a stark reminder that in any conflict fueled by petty power and blind bureaucracy, the most effective weapon is not emotion or volume, but meticulous, unassailable legal truth. They looked down on the farmer and his land, failing to realize that the history of the ground beneath their feet was a map to their own undoing. The HOA learned the hard way. Sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the deed that changes the entire game. They thought they were buying his land, but he was quietly buying their freedom of movement. What is the most absurd HOA rule you've ever had to fight? Let us know in the comments below.